Can you walk across Death Stranding in a completely straight line? This was a question I asked myself before I had even finished the game. I mean, we all know the idea is by no means original, but with how complex Death Stranding's environments can be, and how demanding some of the cliffs and mountains are, as well as having several ways to overcome these hurdles like ladders, climbing anchors, zip lines, etc., I figured Death Stranding would be one of the most perfect games for me to try this out in. So, let's find out if it's really possible, shall we? First of all, I'll explain some rules. Firstly, I can only do this entire expedition in one trip, meaning if there's a player's postbox directly in my path and in my reach from the line, I cannot use it to replenish my supplies. Secondly, vehicles will be prohibited as well. After all, we're trying to walk across Death Stranding, not drive. And thirdly, of course, I have to remain as close to the line as possible throughout the entire trip, throughout all three of the regions. And while we're on the topic of regions, the only way for me to travel from one region to the next is by fragile jumping. Fortunately, this is completely unavoidable. However, I will be traveling in a straight line through each region separately. I'll be starting off in the eastern region at the entrance of the Isolation Ward north of central Knot City, and making my way all the way down to Port Knot City in the line shown here. Then, in the central region, I'll be making my way from the entrance of Lake Knot City all the way downwards to the Kyle Relay at the bottom. And finally, we'll be finishing in the awful western region, making our way from the distribution center downwards towards Edge Knot City. And with all that out of the way, we can grab our equipment and begin. For equipment, I'm bringing some power gloves, a level 3 all-terrain skeleton, a spare pair of level 3 bridges boots, 12 ladders, 6 climbing anchors, a floating carrier, a non-lethal assault rifle in case I need to deal with some mules, a couple of boxes of VOG decoys, a couple of blood bags, and a spare battery. I prayed this was enough and started the journey north of Capital Knot City. And right off the bat, we had a problem. The line goes straight through some walls that are out of bounds. Unfortunately, I had to rejoin the line when I exited the walls, as the game doesn't actually allow you to build upwards and above these. Not only that, but the line went right over this building here. So I couldn't just go around this one. So 10 seconds into the run, I had already used a ladder and a climbing anchor to get down. Not the best start. From here, though, it was a quick drop down onto the sandy shore of Capital Knot, and we were well on our way through familiar terrain. There was a rock that seemed like it would be impossible to climb over until I slipped slightly to the left and found a nicer platform to use in order to climb over it. Then I bumped into this wall that I completely forgot existed. You can't actually get over or through these, so I just walked around and met myself on the other side. And from here, it was pretty smooth sailing. Had to walk through a few rivers, but since I had only just started, my full stamina bar was way more than enough to see me through. The only bad thing about this whole section was looking at what was coming. I could see a giant hill ahead, and I was way too busy thinking about how the hell I was going to traverse that, and when I finally reached it, I had no idea what I was going to do. I'd already used the ladder, and I really wanted to steer away from placing any others down if possible, especially since it looked like I might need to use multiple to get over this. So I just tried to climb it. At first, it went pretty well, until this really weird part where Sam would just keep slipping down despite it clearly looking like an area he could stand on. After minutes of trying to slip and manipulate my way up there, I decided to stray away from the line ever so slightly and jump from the right side to the left. And that worked nicely. I could continue climbing normally for a little while, but it was soon apparent that sticking to the line completely just was not going to be feasible. On the right side, there seemed like some nice rocks to jump onto, and they worked pretty damn nicely, allowing me to reach an even higher area that was closer to the line. But unfortunately, that's where the good news ends. There was absolutely no way for me to climb from where I was to any higher without staying quite far away from the line or placing a ladder. So I chose the ladder option and placed one down. I didn't quite place it in the right position though, so whenever I got to the top, Sam came tumbling back down the cliff, and this happened much more than once.
There's no feeling more intense than starting over. If you got your best shirt dry cleaned before a wedding and then immediately dropped food on it, no amount of forward progress is guaranteed. Some cliffs are too sheer or too slippery. And the player is constantly, unremittingly in danger of falling and losing everything.
Until, eventually, after many tries, over 30 minutes of trying to jump from the ladder onto the ledge that was almost in my grasp, I placed the new ladder and climbed that one instead. I was so reluctant to do this, but I saw no other way of keeping close to the line. Maybe I could have made that other ladder work, but Sam just wasn't getting close enough to the ledge for me to feel motivated enough to continue attempting it. Also, just to clarify, you don't get the ladder back if you decide to dismantle it, so that's why I was so reluctant to place a second one. Anyway, back on track. Now that we were finally over that hill, we were able to continue. Getting down steep cliffs is substantially easier than going up, so the next couple of minutes went pretty smoothly. The game can be slightly janky sometimes, and every time I fell a great distance, BV started crying, so I had to stop and calm him down. I continued, and ahead of me, I saw nothing in close proximity that would hold me. Not long after, though, came a huge problem. I encountered this precipice, and I immediately knew that climbing this was not going to be possible without a ladder. I wanted to be quick though, since BTs were in the area, but when I tried to place a ladder down, all it said was outside permitted construction area. I had no idea what this meant, but dismissed it for the time being as I found a tiny spot where the game allowed the ladder to be placed. Unfortunately, this position was not useful at all. Just like the hill before it, the ladder was awkwardly in the air, and the end was way too far away from the cliff for me to be able to jump to it. I tried for a while to try and jump somewhere, but nothing worked. So I reluctantly placed another ladder again, and this time it was further to the right in another tiny random space where the game let me place it. This one was much better, and thankfully allowed me to continue my journey. Or it would if there wasn't an invisible wall right at the very top. It was at this point that I realized the outside permitted construction area message meant that I was not allowed to place the ladder there because the top of the ladder was out of bounds. So I had to wrap all the way around this hill and meet myself here, which was the next point I could actually come in contact with the line. And trust me, I tried sticking myself as close as I possibly could to that line, but I cannot bring the game to let me out of bounds when it didn't let me. This is unfortunately the only solution I had to this. Now that we were back at the line though, we were probably at the halfway point of the eastern region. We were also approaching an awkward but doable section of the trek. I had to try and keep as close as I could to the line while not sliding right off this hill. This wasn't too difficult as the game was quite generous in letting me slip back to my feet, but it took a few minutes of trial and error to get through. The game was especially generous at some parts of the next section, where it somehow let me cross the majority of this gap that the Odra deck considered a dangerous mixture of yellow and red marks without much difficulty. Not sure how or why, but I got across, and after a little more climbing and calming BB, we finally got to a relaxed section. For around 5 minutes, the walk was super easy. Nothing at all to stop me in my tracks. We made excellent progress. Until I encountered what I thought would be the toughest part of this region, this lake. Without all too much consideration, I removed the floating carrier from my back and tried to use it to cross the lake. Turns out it doesn't float on water. I tried a few times for a while and nothing happened. But I thought maybe I needed to rev it up, so I stepped back a lot, back towards a rock, and gained a bunch of speed. I barely went anywhere. So I decided what would happen if I just fought the water. And I was surprised. Sam handled the current extremely well, and it honestly was not that difficult getting across this huge pool of water. I just needed to rest a few times and I was at the end. I'm gonna cut to the chase here. I climbed up the rocks after the river using 2 ladders, only to meet our old friend out of bounds again. Just as before, I'm afraid there's nothing I can do here. My only option was to wrap all the way around, travel through the BT-infested ravine, and meet at the other end of this cliff. And yeah, this was definitely out of bounds. I mean, just look at this. And this wasn't even close to the line. And finally, we were there. The final descent before Port Knot City and the conclusion of the eastern region of Death Stranding. After a few drops using some climbing anchors, we were here. So, can you travel through Death Stranding's eastern region in a completely straight line? No. No, you can't. Regardless of whether you place your marker at the isolation ward or directly on top of Capital Knot City, the line takes you through impossible places that you cannot access. But aside from these areas, sticking to the line didn't prove incredibly difficult, with the exception of a few troublesome hills and rocks. And with that, we say goodbye to the eastern region and embark on the second part of this expedition. It was clear to me that there was absolutely no chance I was getting through the entirety of Death Stranding with only one load of equipment. I needed to restock on supplies for each region, I thought, and so I changed the rule. The equipment I get at the beginning will be resupplied for each region, and since the central region is the largest, I'd figured I'd stock up on extra ladders this time. The beginning of this region was both easy and scary. After passing through what might have been the easiest stretch of land so far, I was going to be passing straight through two huge mule territories back to back, while simultaneously needing to deal with a river here and there. So I took it pretty slowly. Thankfully, the line didn't require me to go straight through the camp, so I only really had to deal with one or two mules here and there. I played it somewhat patiently, waiting for them to turn around so I could continue, and the first camp went flawlessly. I managed to get past them without any issues at all. The second camp is where I make probably one of the dumbest mistakes I've ever made in this game. While traveling through both camps, I kept the non-lethal assault rifle out in case I got into any combat. At the end of the second camp, I had to climb over a somewhat tall rock, and while I drop, I press L2 and R2 to grip in anticipation for the drop, and this instead aims down my weapon and starts shooting at the ground. This obviously alerted the nearby mules, and I prepared myself for a couple of them to appear soon. Thankfully, only one really appeared, and I just took him out from a distance before continuing onward. I saw a large group of mules approaching me from a distance, so I ran like hell and managed to get out unharmed. This was a stupid mistake that I really could not afford to make again, because this was not the last time I would be encountering mule territory. What followed this was an almost 10-minute section of just walking. No ladders, climbing anchors, or any special jumps were needed. Everything I encountered I was able to just walk or climb over. There was quite a bit of water, but if I just took those parts slowly, I had no problem with them. The next problem I did encounter was actually this tiny little river. The OG deck recognized that this river was actually deep water, which is the red marks. Just walking into this would cause me to lose most of my cargo and, arguably more tragically, have to stray far away from the line to go and retrieve it. But instead, I took a small risk, and instead of placing a ladder, I simply jumped over it. Before the weather station, I came across this really tall rock that I knew was not possible to climb without utilizing a ladder. I actually placed the ladder in a really nice position, and I was able to climb the rock without getting very far away from the line at all. A success, I'd say, and only one ladder was used. Typically, the line went straight through the weather station. From my casual playthrough, I knew you could actually climb over the station if you placed ladders, but I didn't know if you could go completely over the top of it. I managed to get to the second highest platform, but the moving radar at the very top of the station was, well, moving, so the game didn't allow me to place a ladder here. I wrapped around as close as I could to the line and just jumped down the other side. There was a short climb after this, and following that there were a chain of 3 or 4 different rocks that all unfortunately required a ladder. I was using a lot of damn ladders, and I had only just now reached the snow mountains. I was starting to get a little worried, but I carried on. The following section was 2 big mountains, and these proved to be the most difficult part of this entire expedition. The beginning of the snow mountains proved to be pretty rough in general, but it had nothing on these two. After using 2 ladders to reach the first mountain, I just could not find places to put them. The hill was just way too steep. I tried placing them on sections that the OG deck recognized to be yellow, and eventually I found some extremely tiny spots that let me reach the top. The fact I had to use so many ladders here was so bad because I had yet an even tougher climb ahead of me. But for the time being, we were pretty free to go. We passed right next to the geologist and had to climb a steep rock next to him. We somehow managed to climb this without a ladder and was extremely close to the line the entire time, so at least the game was somewhat generous here. And we had one final small descent before the mountain. The one that ended it all. Yeah, spoiler alert, this is the end of the road for us with our current equipment. I tried for so long to get over this mountain, but it was just way too steep. No matter where I put the ladder, I could not get any further than that. There was seemingly nowhere for me to jump that the Oja deck didn't consider red. I tried for so long to see if I could get anywhere remotely close to the line, and I had no luck. I kept falling and falling and falling, and I fell so much I was starting to get really annoyed at BB. I ran out of ladders, and the expedition was over. But I feel like the fact I was only limited to having a set amount of equipment was needless. The point is to see if I can walk across Death Stranding, not to see if I can walk across Death Stranding using only a certain amount of resources, although I could do that in a later video. So I ran to the paleontologist and grabbed 12 additional ladders. The final attempt at trying to get over this mountain was trying to get onto the right side. I managed to find a tiny spot where Sam could stand, and miraculously, the game actually let me place an additional ladder here at a very specific angle. And sadly, this was as far as I got. 2 ladders up. I was officially defeated by this mountain. I tried for so long to try and get an angle, any sort of direction where the game allowed me to get onto a higher platform, but I just couldn't. I gave up. I instead wrapped myself around and rejoined the line at the closest point I could, and continued the journey from there. It feels bad that I was conquered by this mountain, but falling constantly and having to soothe BB every time was really testing my patience, and honestly, I think it's a lost cause anyway. Now that we were at last back on course, I was happy. I felt better. I forgot about my shameful defeat back there and instead started to worry about the fact that I was once again about to enter some mule territory. Those of you expecting some gunshots though, I'm sorry, we're not having any of that today. I got past this small section without much problems, using a couple more ladders to get over more rocks, just the usual. And there we have it, the final stretch. I only needed to use a climbing anchor to get down this small section and we were home free. The chiral relay was in sight. But of course, the game couldn't let me go with one last caveat. In order to reach the marker, I had to somehow climb upwards onto the relay, and the only way I could do this was with a ladder. I precariously placed it on this large piece of shrapnel, and after suffering an unfortunate fall on the first attempt, I made it atop the relay and had at last reached the marker. So, is it possible to walk across the central region in Death Stranding in a completely straight line? Honestly, probably. Perhaps not from the direction I walked from, but unlike the eastern region, there weren't any completely out of bounds sections. Only an impossibly steep cliff that I honestly saw no way of climbing without using a zip line. And with that, it marks the completion of the second part of our expedition, and we could finally commence the third and final part. So here we are, the third and final section of this journey. Just looking at the map, I had very little hope. The line clearly went through buildings and out of bounds multiple times, but I was still intrigued to see just how far we could take this, how many buildings we were allowed to get on top of, and how close we could truly stay to the line. This area starts off with a giant tar pool. This doesn't wear down stamina, it just slows you down, so this was just a case of holding forward and being patient. And once we were finally out of the tar, the line went straight through our first building. You cannot place ladders inside the tar, so I backed up slightly and placed the ladder on a broken pillar, which allowed us to get onto a higher platform of the building. The line went even further through, and I was even able to place another ladder up here. However, the building was still too tall for the ladder, and there was not a single platform that looked like I could stand on it. So I dropped onto one of these things, whatever they're called, and tried to place a ladder here, with no luck. The slope was too slanted and prevented me from placing it down. I tried all of them and had absolutely no luck at all. So I decided to reroute the line slightly. I placed it directly on top of the distribution center and sent it directly south to Edgenot City, and met up with it at the earliest point the game allowed. But it didn't take long for the line to once again go straight through a building. I saw an opportunity though. I placed a ladder onto one of the outside metal staircases on the middle floor, hoping it would let me place a ladder in there in order to reach the roof. After discovering that Norman Reedus is incapable of climbing staircases, I somehow fit through and onto the higher platform, only to discover that, to everybody's disappointment, that this was out of bounds and I could not proceed to place a ladder. But I did leave a smiley face sign up here, so if any fellow porters out here would like to come up here and give me likes, I'd appreciate it. Oh, and any of my other structures too, for that matter. I left most of them out there in the wastes. At this point, I'd lost all hope. The way this map is laid out is just does not allow for any sort of straight line routing. I placed a couple of ladders down in order to follow the line as much as I possibly could, but at the end of it all, the line just clipped through way too many buildings that were seemingly impossible to climb and more than likely out of bounds anyway. So, can you walk through Death Stranding's western region in a completely straight line? Absolutely not. Not a chance in hell. You'll have to wait for Boundary Break for that one, I'm afraid. And there we have it. All 3 regions of Death Stranding while walking in a completely straight line for as much of it as possible. The eastern region is somewhat problematic with a couple of out-of-bounds sections that are insurmountable, requiring you to circle around and rendezvous at a later point, but other than these instances, it's very much doable. The central region felt the most smooth. No out-of-bounds sections, just a few insanely steep mountains, with one of them defeating me completely. And finally, as we just said, the western region is unfortunately laid out in such a way that it makes a challenge like this impossible. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you haven't already, I sincerely encourage you to watch GeoWizard's straight line mission across Wales. It's a ton of fun and I enjoyed every second of it. Follow my social media in the description below. I stream on Twitch most days, and with all that said, if you want to see something similar to this in the future or perhaps with other games, drop a comment. Thanks for watching everyone, and I will see you next time.